If we want to explain Wolsey's rise to power, his holding on to power and his eventual loss of power, in one sense there's a very straightforward answer. And that's just to say that Wolsey was useful to Henry VIII. That answer gets us quite a long way. Certainly it explains Wolsey's rise to power. Wolsey first became a powerful political figure because he was useful to Henry VIII in avoiding the kind of controls that the surviving councils of Henry VII had tried to exercise over the young King Henry. This wasn't just giving him strong advice, it was, for example, insisting on all of them, or many of them, countersigning the documents that the young king produced. So for Henry VIII to find a councillor who wasn't part of that set and was prepared to help him in some ways move around them was very useful to him. Wolsey also very rapidly showed that he was useful to the king because he would work extremely hard, and he would work extremely hard at things that Henry wasn't himself very interested in. We shouldn't get the impression that Henry wasn't interested in working at being king, but I think he thought there were some things that were really important and that you needed him, the king himself, to do, and there were other things, mostly involving quite boring paperwork, that could probably be left to somebody else who was very competent and very happy to do them. What that meant was that when the partnership between Henry and Wolsey worked right, it was very effective teamwork. They did teamwork even in the sense that negotiating with foreign ambassadors, Henry would welcome them and be very cheerful with them and say how pleased he was that negotiations were going well, and would then send them back to Wolsey, who would start insisting on very, very tricky points of detail and doing the hard bargaining with them before he needed to pass them back to Henry to play good cop all over again. So this is a working partnership that develops between Wolsey and Henry, and it's very effective. It's very effective, and Wolsey retains power for a long time because he managed to give Henry what he wanted. His first period of coming to prominence, he gives Henry success in war in 1512 to 1514, and in particular Henry's big campaign in France in 1513, when Terouanne and Tournai are captured and Henry's able to enter these cities as a great conquering king, what he aspired to be. But there's some success too in war in the 1520s against the French and against the Scots. And it's success which is managed by Wolsey, particularly in financial terms, because Wolsey is very effective at raising war taxation on the large scale needed to pay for these very big, expensive campaigns against a country, France, which after all had a much larger population and much larger revenues than England had. So Wolsey delivered success in war. He also delivered success in diplomacy, in making settlements with other European powers which secured England's place in Europe and secured Henry's place as a great ruler. The Treaty of London in 1518, a universal peace treaty binding all the European powers together, negotiated at London under Henry's leadership. The Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, a celebration and a set of negotiations which put Henry on a level with Francis I of France, who had won much greater military victories than Henry had, who ruled over a much larger and more powerful country than Henry did, and yet the two of them were put on a level. And there's even to some extent success in diplomacy in the later 1520s, as Wolsey tried to make Henry's England the power broker between Francis I of France and the Emperor Charles V, his great rival. So there's success in diplomacy too. There's success in making Henry a magnificent monarch. Wolsey's own building projects were very spectacular, but he's involved in big building projects for the king too. He's involved in giving the king a splendid court with tournaments and music and up-to-the-minute Italianate art, all the things that marked Henry out as one of the great rulers of Europe in his day. He gave Henry what he needed too in terms of more substantial policies. We can think about those in more detail later, but in terms of making Henry a king who delivered effective justice to his subjects, making Henry a king who cared for all his subjects by social policy that dealt with the social and economic problems of the day, making England an educated country by particularly Wolsey's own college at Oxford, but then the system of feeder schools that he set up for it. These were all things that made Henry and Henry's government a government that cared effectively for its subjects, that did his job as king. After all, in the coronation oath, Henry had promised that he would give effective justice to his subjects, and that's what Wolsey was helping him to do. And lastly, Wolsey gave Henry what he wanted in terms of his management of the church. Rather than have to preside as king over a group of sometimes quarrelsome and difficult bishops in order to control what was going on in the English church, Henry could just use Wolsey as a single manager. A Wolsey given great confidence by the king, but also given great powers by the Pope to enable him to preside over the English church, and therefore to deliver for Henry the kind of prestigious leadership in church reform and in keeping the church running in the right direction in terms of its relationship with the laws of the state and the rest of the legal system in the way that Henry wanted. So Wolsey's success rested on doing what Henry needed, and that makes it easy to explain. We might think Wolsey's failure. Wolsey fails to give Henry what he wants as the 1520s go on.